All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, January 3rd of 2022. Happy 2022, everybody. It is indeed a Monday here, so we've got a couple different things to do on stream today. We'll be announcing the winners of this week's weekly NFL Max Challenge. Now 1 week left remaining in the weekly Max Challenge. We'll be doing our giveaways on our Wheel of Names spinners to give out some free tickets, and then of course open Q&A, answering your guys' questions. I see there's a few questions that have come in over the weekend this morning, so we'll answer some questions here on stream as well. Let's go ahead and get this pulled up here first just to get things going here. Weekly Max Challenge. Just finishing up week 17. There's one more week of the challenge here. We will be doing the free roll, most likely in wildcard weekend for NFL. So more details to come if you've earned a ticket for the free roll, or if you're going to be earning a ticket for having participated all 18 weeks. We'll get some details out for that here over the next week or so everybody kind of knows what is going on there. But really just 1 week left here as we close the door on week 17 for the weekly Max Challenge. So we had a lot of fun with this year. I hope you guys did too. It was awesome giving out some goodies all season long. Definitely looking at doing more things like this in the future, and primarily figuring out exactly what this looks like with our relationship with DraftKings and FanDuel to make sure that we're getting the tickets out and getting them out in a timely manner. Because I know we had a couple speed bumps with that here towards the end of the season, but I think all things considered went pretty well and had a lot of fun with it. You'll see I did add a note here this morning here, kind of on that note, through the end of the season. So basically just for this week and next week, we're going to be just awarding the value of all tickets, one as SaberSim credit. Just became a little bit too overwhelming for the sites to be able to get all these tickets out in a timely manner with all the other things that they've got going on. So all of the value of the tickets will just be given out as SaberSim credit through the end of the year. So if you win the DraftKings giveaway, for example, that's $75 of value. That's 150 tickets to a 50-cent contest. That's $75. You'll get $75 of SaberSim credit instead. So just for the last 2 weeks, this week and next week, and then obviously for the actual free rolls themselves, that'll be put through by the sites themselves. So that there'll be the normal cash values there in the contest. So, but anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. So on the DraftKings side, our top finisher for this week. So again, this week winning $77 of ticket value in terms of SaberSim credit, along with an extra free month and an entry into that private free roll on DraftKings. Let me go ahead and pull this up here. I lost it on my screen here. 25th place is Noop Masaka. Congratulations, Noop Masaka. Nacho Man in Nacho Man Randy Savage, or whatever your name is in YouTube. I know you're often here. So congratulations, winning $77 of SaberSim credit, along with a free month of SaberSim and an entry to that private free roll. And on the FanDuel side, it's Cusplove in 30th place in the Pooch Punt. Will be winning $25 of SaberSim credit, along with an additional free month and a ticket into the FanDuel free roll that we'll be running here in the next couple weeks. So congratulations to our two highest scorers. I know getting close again to the end of this contest here, but both winners this week have entered every single week. So again, just goes to show that this contest and DFS as a whole is all about marathon, not a sprint. Right. It's really been awesome to see some of you guys that have participated here every single week get some rewards for it, because that's kind of our goal here. The whole goal from this giveaway, this contest, whatever you want to call it, the whole season, was to create a contest that emphasized and rewarded the things that we think are important in DFS. So that's contest selection, that's treating things as a marathon, not a sprint, and being kind of dedicated and entering and continuing to play. So awesome to see that paying off here. But those are our two winners for the highest score. We'll go ahead. Let's jump into the giveaways. So again, 3 names we're going to draw on the DraftKings side for $75 of SaberSim credit. Use it for your tickets in the Minimax next week if you like. Kind of all works out in the wash. But whatever you want to do with that here, let's go ahead and get our names pulled up On the DraftKings side, 48 entrants this week, 3 in 48 chance for any of you guys here. And let's go ahead and get this going here. So 48 entries. We'll do a quick shuffle, and we will start drawing some names. Let's do our first spin here. And our first winner is Wear and Tear, 1014. Congratulations, Wear and Tear. A familiar name, too, so congratulations. Let's get our winner number 2 here. Sam Jeff Coat. Congratulations, Sam? Jeff? I don't know. Maybe Sam Jeff, but congratulations either way. Our second winner here. And our third winner on the DraftKings side for this week. Is CDE Jesus 5486. Congratulations to all 3 of you. Again, $75 in SaberSim credit. We'll get that out to you today. Get you an email letting you know you won. That'll be applied to whenever your next invoice is with SaberSim. And we'll go ahead. Let me copy this. And we'll go ahead and jump over to the FanDuel side and keep it going. I see a couple questions are already starting to come in YouTube chat as well, so that's great. Keep it coming. We are doing our giveaways right now for the weekly max challenge here. Once this is done, we'll go ahead. We'll jump into open Q&A. We'll answer everybody's questions. Let's go ahead and clear this out. Clear that as well. And get our FanDuel list up here. Basically, I mean, virtually a 1 in 5 shot at the FanDuel side now. 57 entrants. We'll run the spinner 10 times, playing for $7.50 in SaberSim credit here. We'll go ahead and do our shuffle here, and let's get into it. And it's ST Cohen, 79, is our first winner here on the FanDuel side. Winner number 2. Oh, right on the edge. Really close. Ogden, 333.02. Oh, there you go, Cody. Canopticopter. Winner number 3 on the FanDuel side. All right, let's get number 4. All right, BCW is our 4th winner here. Number 5 is SportsFan 14. Congratulations, SportsFan 14, who is coincidentally the original user here that recommended wheelofnames.com for us, which has turned out to be such a trusty little tool for us all season. I think the next time we go ahead and do one of these giveaways, maybe we'll try to get something a little more impressive than the wheelofnames.com, but it has certainly been useful for us this season. So Ryux is our 6th winner. Congratulations, Ryux. Gerard 42 is our 7th winner. Eighth winner is Florida Thunder, 70. I've always just kind of assumed that's Florida Thunder. I definitely could be wrong, but I think it's Florida Thunder. So congratulations either way. Our 9th winner is CP Hustler. And our final FanDuel giveaway winner as we close out Week 17 is wear and tear almost doubled up here, but it's T-Swift98. Congratulations, T-Swift98. So again, our 10 winners on the FanDuel side, $7.50 in SaberSim credit. We'll get it added to your account later this afternoon. Get an email out to you. Congratulations to all of our winners this week. And we will, of course, I'll go ahead and pull this up one more time. We've got one more week here. So don't forget, especially if you've been keeping your streak up for all 18 weeks so far, don't forget in the final week here, week 18, or I guess it's typically been week 17, week 18 in NFL DFS always is a little bit of a funny week just because there's a lot of teams that don't really have anything to play for, potentially resting starters and things like that. But should be fun and definitely still worth entering this contest for one more week. After that, wild card weekend is what we are targeting for our free roll. So more details to come there. If you've earned a ticket, or I know some of you have multiple tickets, stay tuned for that. We'll probably let people know, most likely by email, but maybe reach out on Slack as well. Whatever makes sense there. So looking forward to that. And again, as we're kind of winding this down here the last couple weeks, it's been a lot of fun doing this every single week. We are planning on doing this again. Don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I would say almost certainly by the start of next NFL season, but also starting to talk about, maybe doing something for baseball if baseball starts on time. So we'll figure out exactly how this is all going to look. But we had a lot of fun doing this. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did. So anyway, without much further ado, let's go ahead and transition here. We'll go ahead and start answering some questions. I see handful of questions again in YouTube chat. I'm going to start with the questions that came in earlier here in Slack over the weekend. And we will get to everything today, though, I promise. So let me go ahead and take a look and get some questions here. So I am going to, let's see here. Let me go ahead. I'm trying to get caught up here and see where we left off some of the questions. So let's do this. We'll start with I'm going to go ahead and start here. We'll bounce around a little bit today just because I see there's been a lot of questions that came in through Slack, and some of these have already gotten answered, and there was some discussion in Slack. So we'll go ahead and start there. Start here. We'll bounce around a little bit, but this was from Rick over the weekend, and I think it's just a good question to answer just because it's important to know how these custom projections work. So Rick said, not sure if you guys can answer this, but how does the optimizer run when using run pure projections? I'll answer this just in general for a custom projection standpoint, but he mentioned that they're way different than SaberSim, aren't being calculated via the sims, so was curious how the optimizer picks buckets of games when using those projections. Yeah, so this is kind of an important thing to note. So I'll just explain, this is just how it works for all custom projections, right? So if we change Jokic's projection, for example, to 54-27, right, you are still going to take advantage of all of the powerful simulation data we have. What is going to happen is we're going to take every single game sim we have for Jokic's game, and whatever he scored in that particular outcome, we are going to change it. We are going to reduce it in this case by the difference of the original projection and your custom projection. So in this case, every single one of Jokic's game simulations, his actual score that he scores in that sim is going to be reduced by 2 fantasy points. The effect of that is you basically shift the exact distribution, the exact range of outcomes he has here, 2 points to the left is basically what happens. But the distribution is the same. So it means that like you still get that player's upside outcomes at the same rate as you would have in the sims originally, and the floor outcomes and the mean outcomes and all of those things, but they're just shifted slightly to the left. So if you use, if you're using an alternative projection system like Run Pure or anything else, whatever you're using, you're basically doing this, but to every single player in the pool. And you're just kind of shifting these ranges of outcomes accordingly. So you still get to take advantage of all the sims when we go in, and I definitely always appreciate too. It's clear, who answered this question again, Rick, that you've got kind of a good sense of how the sim variance buckets sims when you're building lineups, which is amazing. Always important to remember how that works. So when we go in and bucket these sims randomly, right? So that's what happens with the sim variance slider, right? It's going to take a random amount of game simulations and use the projections that those players scored in those game sims to build your lineups. If you've changed projections or you have custom projections anywhere here anywhere for any number of players or for every single player. We'll bucket the sims the same way, but now we're taking the updated projection sims for each player in the game. So very good question. Important to know if you're, no matter what you're doing with projections, really just a very good thing to know here. And we'll go ahead and move on. Okay, cool. I wanted to touch on this as well. First of all, Wear and Tear, not sure if you're watching, asked a quick question about how to late swap on an iPhone. I sent you a link to a video to our FAQ here. I guess I'll talk about this just real quick and pull this up so you guys can see it. This is a common question, how to use the entry editor and late swap on mobile. So we do have this help desk entry. It's got a video that I actually recorded on my phone doing this in full for both FanDuel and DraftKings. And then Ross went in and also did kind of, for DraftKings specifically, a step-by-step with screenshots on iOS. I did mine on Android, but he did it with iOS. So you can kind of follow along here either way. I know it's a little bit confusing the first time you do it, but once you get familiar with how to do this entry editor and late swapping on your phone, it's very easy, pretty simple, and lets you late swap and make changes when you need to if you're especially not going to be able to get to a computer, which happens pretty commonly on the NBA side of things. So, but interesting question here. This is from Blue Devil, and it was a question about Max's tweet. And Max actually chimed in, responded here, but I thought I'd pull it up. Let me go ahead and let me see. Is there an easy way to get the tweet up? Well, I'll just read Max's tweet. He said, Chase Edmonds, 9% in the Millionaire Maker, 27% in the Wildcat, and 33% in the $2,222 main event Millionaire. And he said, these are the types of situations that high stakes players take advantage of and get an edge. So the question said, saw this tweet from Max and thought it was interesting, wondering if you, or anyone else from the SaberSim team could expand on this a bit more. Is Max implying that at a 9% ownership in the Millionaire Maker, much larger field with a wider range of outcomes, Edmonds was a good play, but in the higher stakes contests, smaller field with generally sharper players, where he was over 27% owned, Edmonds warranted fading. Contest ownership at the different levels is not something that I'm good at. I would not have thought that Edmonds would come in that high in those higher dollar contests. Appreciate any additional elaboration on this example. And Max chimed in and said, yeah, I'm saying he was a good play. High stakes players were late swapping to him or planning for Connor to be out. Low stakes players didn't want to deal with it / weren't aware. Not saying anything about what to do in high stakes necessarily, although there are different dynamics. Interestingly could have been a good fade in high stakes. And I just thought this was worth noting here. I mean, this is an NFL example, but this is a lot of what I'm talking about all the time in NBA, is that so much of the field isn't even going to try to late swap or even going to bother at late swapping, even at low, especially at low, but even to like medium stakes contests, like something like the Millionaire Maker. This is why I'm always talking about when we're talking about overall strategy here on the NBA side. I gave this example. Actually, let's just jump back to NBA. I gave this example probably 2 or 3 times last week of you could sit here and you could hyper analyze this 10-game slate and figure out exactly what the optimal ownership is of every single player on the slate and come up with an edge. And that would probably be the edge that you would have to come up with, or at least, think about if there was no late swap at all. But you don't really need to do that, or it's not even efficient to do that when you know that as soon as news breaks after lock, as long as you're playing mostly at low or medium stakes, nobody's going to make that adjustment that they need to be doing anyway, right? The example I've just kind of been giving consistently is you could say, okay, Giannis is going to be 16% owned and his optimal ownership is 20%. So you're going to roster him at 25% to get the additional leverage over the field. But when halfway through the slate, we get news that Brandon Ingram and Chris, actually, yeah, maybe even Chris Middleton's a better example, right? Halfway through the slate, we get news that Chris Middleton's out, and now Giannis's optimal ownership is, I don't know, 40% or something like that. Like, there was no point in spending all that time to figure out the optimal ownerships of a system that is going to change as soon as the slate locks anyway. And I think this kind of tweet gets at that, right? Like you could have, and often in NFL, I count on things staying relatively consistent even through the afternoon late swap window. I'm not really banking on as much actionable late swap news in NFL as I am in NBA. But this is still kind of the same idea is, I made a huge swap and pivoted into quite a bit of Edmonds before those afternoon games. And I think that accounted for a huge edge that I had in my lineups at the stakes I was playing with on Sunday. And you're just not going to get that. The field just isn't going to do that at low stakes. And I just thought this was the perfect example. I thought this was a good opportunity to bring it up. I do think the discussion of trying to figure out how ownership is going to be different at different stakes is a much bigger discussion. I think trying to figure out where it makes sense to fade ownership at higher stakes is an more interesting question to figure out. I think Max has an interesting idea here, and with hindsight, that Edmonds fade probably feels pretty good, especially considering that it came at the expense of Rashad Penny for a lot of people. I still think it's probably a safer bet that in a situation where value has opened up because of a late swap opportunity, because of something that has come after lock, even at higher stakes, it's unlikely that the field is really going to ever get to optimal ownership of that player because of the salary and positional restrictions that already exist in the lineups. So in other words, if Edmonds became a good value play in the late swap window, for example, right, and he ended up being 33% owned, right, I would imagine if we could calculate this, that his optimal ownership based on his range of outcomes was actually still much higher than that, because there were plenty of lineups that you couldn't have swapped into Edmonds because of salary restrictions or positional restrictions, or somebody had already used their 2 running back and flex spots, so they couldn't have gotten to Edmonds in that particular case. But 33% is far closer to his optimal ownership than 9% that we are seeing in the Millionaire Maker. So that additional 24% of, oh God, is that what it is? Yeah, 24% of additional ownership discount that you're getting at the lower stakes is just additional value to your lineups. And I just think it's just a great example of this, something that I talk about constantly here. Here, let me change this so people know what I'm talking about. I think it's just a great example of something that I talk about all the time, of how much value late swapping really gives you, right? Because it's not just the fact that you're getting to swap into the most important and up-to-date news, right? Even if you could guarantee that the field would late swap optimally every single time news broke, you would still do it because it's information that's useful in your lineups. In reality, you're getting not only the most up-to-date information, right? You're getting to play better, objectively better plays, but you're getting to play against a field that is now suboptimal and doesn't adjust. So just a perfect example of that. I think it's so fitting for NBA. I know we got it in the NFL slate on Sunday, which is great. Doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes NFL slates, afternoon inactives come out and you just don't really get any useful information at all. But we did yesterday, and it's a really good example of which is what I'm always talking about in NBA. And we get it in NBA almost every single night. But that was the first thing that popped into my mind, and just wanted to acknowledge it because before Max chimed in Slack, I was definitely prepared to talk about this a little bit today, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit. But let's keep it going here. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. So those are the 3 questions or so that came in office hours today. Actually, you know what? Let's hit this one because this one came in. Let's hit these 2. There's 2 other questions that came in over the weekend here. We'll get these first. This one is from Neil. This is another question that's come in before. He says, does it make sense to turn down or off the ownership fade slider when fading the chalk? I faded Barrios, Cup, and AB today, wondering if I should have turned off the ownership fade slider since I was fading 3 of the chalkiest players on the entire slate in step 1. I think this is interesting. I've gone back and forth a little bit on what I really kind of think here. My gut is still that it probably makes sense. It still probably makes sense to leave the ownership fade slider where it is, just so you know that the lineups that are getting constructed still have the right kind of amount of ownership and are still leveraging ownership for the rest of the plays on the slate in your lineups accordingly, right? I think even if you're making 2 serious stands on 3 very chalky players, the remaining lineups, especially on an NFL slate, can still be built pretty chalky, and leaving that ownership fade slider on is just going to ensure that you're still getting the right amount of total ownership or even ownership product in your lineups with the remaining players in the pool, right? There are plenty of very chalky lineups that could have been built that don't include any of these 3 players, right? There were other chalky receivers in the pool, And there were plenty of lineups that could have been that aren't including these 3 players. So I think you risk a little bit playing more chalky than you need to, even if you're taking an aggressive stand on 3 chalky players on the slate. That I think it's worth it, right? So, and it's not going to say, that's not to say that leaving your ownership fade slider on is going to build like ridiculously over leveraged lineups, right? If we look at kind of the remaining players that are available, right? The ownership fade slider kind of works both ways, where, you know, if you've taken these 3 out, right? And you get a lineup that is then kind of shoving in, maybe you're building a Mahomes stack with Hill, and you've also got T. Higgins on the other side, and maybe Waddle's in there as just kind of a one-off or something like that, right? And you get these 3 low-owned receiver pieces. The builder will kind of recognize that in the lineup, and you may not need other low-owned pieces in the lineup, right? Because of the ownership fade slider. Right. The ownership fade slider in some ways is just saying, pay attention to ownership. Ownership is important to this lineup. But if we recognize that there are low owned pieces in this lineup with upside already, then the other pieces of the lineup don't necessarily need to additionally be low owned pieces. So, but a good question there. I would say in general, I don't think it makes a ton of sense to adjust the sliders, even if your process is leading you to create the effect of that slider elsewhere. So another good example is with the stacking rule. We get questions sometimes, I've already set a stacking rule. Do I need to leave the correlation slider on? And I always say, yes, leave the correlation slider on, because even though the stacking rule says make sure I have a QB +2 with 1 run back in every lineup, the correlation slider will help make sure that you get the most correlated pieces of that stack in the lineup, right? You get the QB, maybe, you know, you get a pass catching running back in that particular lineup because we understand that a pass catching running back is correlated to his QB, right? You don't get some extra tight end that doesn't catch a lot of passes because that tight end doesn't have a lot of correlation to the QB. So you leave the slider on. I think I feel the same way here, right? Even if you're taking stands with your player pool in step 1, leave the ownership fade slider on so you know that the lineups that you're getting out are still appropriately leveraged for the contest that you're playing. So this is a follow-up question to this. D. Baker said, what if you have a core group of players that you want to lock in? How would that affect the ownership fade slider? I still think it makes sense to leave it on, because what's going to happen there, let's say you're playing NBA tonight, for example, because I think it's a little bit easier to do this with current slates. And let's say you've got a core, you want to play Jokic, and you want to lock some of these value plays, Tice with Wood out again, and maybe Anthony Simons, a couple value plays, right? And this is your core, and it's a pretty chalky core, but it's well-projected plays, and these are the guys you want all 3 of these guys in your lineups. We're just going to lock all 3 of those guys in, right? They're just into every lineup immediately. And then the ownership fade slider is going to be used to build the rest of the lineup out, making sure that every play, right, every player that goes into the lineup has their projections scored in their individual set of sims that's being used to build that lineup compared to their ownership. So that if you have a player that scores 30 points in that set of sims and is 40% owned, and another player scores 29 points and is 2% owned, right, that ownership fade slider is going to help make sure that 29-point scorer at 2% ownership goes in instead of the 30-point score at 40% ownership. It's going to help make sure that the remaining players that go into the lineup are leveraged against ownership. Now, the players that you've locked, right? If you've locked in your core, they're ownership agnostic at that point. They're in every single lineup, right? There's no ownership value proposition made there. We just lock them in. And since they're locked into every single lineup, there's no real difference in the SaberScore of lineups at the end. So you've essentially just got, three locked players. Every single lineup has them. They're constant amongst all lineup. And then we're building and also comparing all the lineups against each other for the remaining 5 players in the lineup. So D. Baker said, thank you. Thank you. We do this show. I haven't mentioned this in a while, but since we've got a pretty good audience here today, so welcome everybody. But I do the show live for a reason. So if you have questions about what I'm talking about here, if something doesn't make sense, fire it off into chat. I try to keep a pretty good eye on chat so that I can pull in these little kind of one-off questions while I'm talking about the topic. Sometimes I miss them, but I'll always get back to it. But there is a reason that I don't go and just take a bunch of emails and sit down and record a question, record an answers, not live, and send them back out to people. I want follow-up questions and clarifying questions. So if you're confused, always feel free to fire them off. But in the meantime, let's go ahead. Let's get this last question. This is the last one that came in through Slack over the weekend. This was also from Rick, actually. So let's go ahead and hit this real quick. He said, I have a bankroll question, primarily a DK player, but keep hearing that Yahoo and FanDuel are softer and thinking about branching out. Say we are using the 5%. Is there a particular way to break it up across the sites? More on FanDuel, for example. Is it plus EV to branch out? Or does it become too difficult to track all the research because some guys are better plays depending on the sites? Good question. So talking about the difference between sites, I think there are some advantages and disadvantages to both. I talked about this a little bit on Friday, what the difference is that I feel between the sites. I don't think there's like an actionable difference between any of the sites where I would say only play on FanDuel and then only add on DraftKings or something like that after you're playing everything you can on FanDuel or anything like that. I think DraftKings maybe plays a little bit sharper just because the contests are bigger, right? And it attracts a little bit of a sharper player base. But I do think their site also behaves a little better on the technical side. I think FanDuel might be a little bit softer, maybe, right? But I think can be a little bit harder to use. Yahoo is much smaller prize pools and things like that. A lot of times also lower rake on Yahoo, but you have smaller contests, right? So they're going to, from the standpoint of effective entrance, these contests are going to play a little bit sharper. And they also have no under $3 entry limit restrictions, right? One of the nice things about DraftKings and FanDuel is if you stick to that under $3 range, you're not going to play against players that have $1 million or more in lifetime winnings. So you get a little bit of a softer pool that way. I think there's trade-offs either way. I would say this, if you're kind of deciding where to play or how should I be spread out or should I all play on one site, I would say it makes the most sense to probably stick to one site until you are playing all of the best GPPs on that site, then spread out, right? Because spreading out and saying that you're playing Yahoo and FanDuel and DraftKings, but you're only playing even just a few $100s total across all three sites is just increasing the like administrative lift of getting all of those lineups in. That takes time and that adds more complexity to your process without probably adding any additional value. Where you start adding value by adding in another site is when you can do so in a way that allows you to play softer contests. So, I mean, first of all, if you've never played on one of these three sites, right, it makes sense to probably open up an account, deposit a little bit, take advantage of any deposit bonuses that you'll get, because you certainly will, and take advantage of the beginner and casual contests that you get to play when you first sign up for a site, because those are ultra soft. So you should do that. But from there, I think it probably really only makes sense to branch out and start adding in these sites when you are playing the best contests on all of one site. So what I mean by that, let's go ahead, let's just like pull up DraftKings and let's say, right, that you were playing. So first of all, I'm going to kind of quickly run through what I think are the best contests in the DraftKings lobby for NBA tonight. This is based on principles of contest selection that we've talked about quite a bit here on this stream. Effective entrance, spreading out and lowering variance, etc. If you are interested or have any questions about what we think are the best contests for NBA and NFL and why, we have two videos on the subject. First one is in our NFL course, how to double your NFL DFS ROI in 15 minutes. Second one is our NBA course, the fastest way to crush NBA DFS in 2021. I'd go watch these. So if you have any questions about contest selection in detail, I'd go watch these. But I would say the main point, the point that it makes sense to probably branch off of just DK, if you're playing DK, is if you're already playing the best DraftKings contests, according to our contest selection principles. So that'd be the and one, the quarter jukebox, the daily dollar, the elbow shot. I think it probably even makes sense to even branch above that $3 range and include the 4-point play, probably the high five single entry, probably both of the high five single entries, actually. And that is probably where that line is drawn. Maybe there's a couple other single entries that fit in here. Yeah, maybe the $12 single entries, right? Those are above 1,000 effective entrants as well. You can get probably at least $150 to $200 of volume down on DraftKings playing just excellent contests, just very good contests. And then at that point, I think it makes more sense to look at what FanDuel has in the lobby and do the same thing there, right? Play the very good contests, the ones that are especially under $3, that have 1,000 or more effective entrants, that have good payout structures, things like that, right? And spread out once it makes sense, once there's a reason to go get there, right? But trust me, as somebody that has done it, if you're not branching out to other sites intentionally to get to softer contests, you are just increasing the complexity of what you have to put up with for a given slate, and it probably isn't increasing your EV. So I would say, up to at least playing probably a few $100s, which is around where that line is of where the best contests are for NBA. For NFL, you can play an enormous amount of volume on any of the sites and play in great contests. But for NBA, you can at least get probably a couple $100s down in the best contests on something like DraftKings before it really makes sense to at least consider, going and checking out some of the contests that are on FanDuel, right? And do the same thing here. So again, if you're listening to this and you're like, what is this guy talking about? Effective entrants, right? What are the best contests? He keeps saying the best contests, right? I don't have time to do the full breakdown of our contest selection principles here. But if you're interested in it, watch the first two videos in either the NFL or the first video in either the NFL or the NBA course. And you'll kind of see how we define the best contests and why. But that's kind of how I would think about this particular question, right? If you're branching out to another site, give yourself a reason to do so apart from just doing it. The reason to do so would be to get action in softer contests that you've already filled on another site. So, okay, I think that was all the questions that came in through the weekend. Again, I think there were some questions that came in prior to that on like Friday in Slack, and it looks like Chris got to a lot of these. So I'm going to assume that these are good. If anybody wants me to talk about one of these questions, just give me another ping. But for now, we have plenty of questions that have come in live. So let's go ahead and hit these real quick. This was from Nancy Drew guy at the start of the stream. What should the total ownership be for basketball and football? I wouldn't think about it this way, to be completely honest. In fact, I think the reason that thinking about ownership sum as like just a number or a target number that you are shooting for is actually the reason that most traditional optimizers don't deal with ownership very well, right? Because ownership sums just in a vacuum, right? I could say 125% or 225% or 175%, right? That doesn't deal with slate context very well, right? And it doesn't deal with contest size, right? So what I mean is like, we might look at a player like Anfernee Simons, and he's projected for 55% owned right now, 8x value, the best value play on the slate, right? And you may say that's a fade at that ownership. You may say that that's inefficient ownership and you should still play him. But if he was projected for 60 points, right, this would be inefficient ownership. He should be owned more than this at that projection, right? You can't look at ownership sums or ownership of an individual player in a vacuum and make a determination purely based on the number alone if that's too much or too little ownership, right? So what do we do then? What I would recommend is get a sense of what the ownership looks like. What is the, let me put it this way. What is the cash game optimal ownership for a given slate? Right? If you're just purely focused on playing the best plays, how owned are those plays? What is the total lineup ownership of a cash game lineup for that particular slate? And that will kind of put like a base layer of this is the baseline amount of ownership that you are getting to if you were just packing in with all of the best plays. So the easiest way to do that, if you want to do this for NBA, for example, tonight, is to go in, set the sliders to cash. You don't need to build 150 lineups, but maybe you build 50 and get an idea of what this is starting to look like here. And we'll build this and we can sort by ownership and see if you just focus on packing as many projected points into your lineup as possible, how much total ownership shows up in these lineups. So we'll go ahead. We'll let this build for a second. The cash game builder takes a little bit longer because it's actually kind of brute force calculating the optimals. So it takes a little bit longer, but we'll give this just a second. I'll catch my breath here, and we'll talk about how I think then you can use this and take into account the context. So, but and you maybe don't even need 50 lineups if you were doing this for yourself. You might be able to get there with 20 or 10, or we're just trying to get a baseline. We're just trying to understand how much ownership is used in the cash lineups for that particular slate. So these are theoretically, with SaberSim projections, the top 50 average projected optimals. And we can get a sense here of how much ownership are these using. Okay. So 211% ownership, right, is the highest projected lineup you can build, the SaberSim projections on DraftKings for tonight's NBA slate at the moment. So everything from there that we are building can kind of be compared. Actually, since we have it up, let's also look at, and I'm going to write this down because I always manage to forget this. So it was 211% ownership, and the top overall projected lineup is 290.7 fantasy points, right? Okay. So now what we can do is we can run builds at different settings and see how, for different sized contests, for a single entry, for example, versus a 150 max example, right? We are going to sacrifice more projected points to lower our ownership even more, right? We lower our ownership a little bit in a single entry. We don't need as much leverage in a single entry. We may lower our ownership significantly in a 150 max. So let's look at this. Let's do a single entry and say we're building lineups for the like $5, right? And let's build 10 and just see what we get out of this, right? And again, maybe we don't need the full 500 pool here. But this is now for a single entry, and we'll see how different is this. How much ownership are we sacrificing? And it might not be very different at all, right? If we think that, well, we'll let this build first. Let's see. Okay, so you can see here, right? We have sacrificed the top overall lineup. We have sacrificed just 3 fantasy points, right? The original cash lineup was projected for 290. We've sacrificed 3 projected points, and we've lowered our ownership by almost 70 cumulative points of ownership, right? But there are other lineups here that are also optimal for the contest, right? In this case, similar deal. We gain a little bit. We gain a half point of projection back. We also gain in another 25 percentage points of ownership back, right? So you can kind of see here, right? Similar deal. A couple lineups that have a little bit higher ownership, right? This is what we feel is appropriate for a single entry contest on tonight's 10 game slate, right? So it's allowing us to take into account, it's allowing us to take into account what's appropriate for a contest and also the individual slate that we're looking at here, because it would be different, right? If the best plays were difficult to find, and according to SaberSim, all of the best plays were not the highest projected plays, right? It would be very easy for us to find low-owned plays, right? Or there's certain times, I keep going back to it. We had our Andre Drummond slates of the beginning of the season where Embiid was out and Drummond was underpriced for like a week straight, right? His optimal ownership was like probably 95%, and he was only coming in at 50 or 60% owned most of the time. So it constantly made sense to basically just jam him and accept all of that additional ownership because it was still inefficient, even though it was driving this number up. But let's look at this here real quick, because I want to make sure I complete this point before I start talking about something else here. So if let's say we're playing the big 150 max, right? Biggest contest we can find, right? Now let's look at kind of how those lineups end up coming out, right? And what we'll probably expect to see here is that we're even sacrificing more raw projected points to drive that ownership sum down even lower, right? Because we need more edge, we need more variance, more relative edge on the field to be successful in a 150 max, right? And that's essentially exactly what we get. We drive this projected score down even lower. Now we're at 284, right? And our ownership has come down even lower, right? Are there still higher ownership lineups in the pool that are viable for this contest that were also viable for the single entry? Of course there are. But some of the top overall lineups, there's even some very high ownership, some lineups, right? But you can see in general, there's an effort made by the builder to sacrifice projected points to lower the raw total ownership of these lineups, even beyond what was viable for the single entries, right? A 279.2 projected lineup when the cash optimal is 290.7 might have never been viable for a single entry contest, but it is viable for a 150 max. So all of this to say is that ownership sum, your total ownership sum, is dependent on definitely the sport and the site you're playing on, but also the size of the slate, the context of the slate, what players are on the slate, what is their salary, what's their projection, what's their ownership, and the contest size you are playing yourself. And traditional tools that basically only give you an ownership cap to deal with that ownership problem are ineffective because of this. Whereas SaberSim allows you to take into account these principles, right? Take into account how much ownership fade is necessary for the contest I'm playing, right? And also to leverage ownership fade against what those players' projections are in the sims that have been pulled for that lineup and make a determination of whether or not you should use that player in the lineup, right? Chalkiest player on the entire slate, if the ownership projections were perfectly accurate, we are still in 150 lineups over the field. In fact, our fourth most positively leveraged player in this pool of lineups is the chalkiest player on the slate in Simons, at least at the moment, right? So we can take into account all of that stuff. So if you are interested in kind of just like looking at this and figuring out this for yourself, the steps I would take are run the cash build first and sort those by ownership and get an idea of how much ownership is in the cash builds, and then write down the projected score as well, and then look at what builds are coming up with for other different sized contests. And you'll see it's different for different sports too, right? In NFL, you'll see it, we are sacrifice projected points much more quickly and more readily than we do in NBA, because NFL is higher variance and less normally distributed range of outcomes for players. So it makes sense for us to be a little bit more aggressive with sacrificing projected points, because average projection matters less in NFL to get more upside in the form of correlation also, but also ownership fade. So I see this question just kind of popped up here. I know this is from about 25 minutes ago, but I think it's relevant here. Tracy asked, is there more value in adjusting ownership that we believe is too low on Saber, or adjusting projections that are too low or high? I mean, there's a value in both. On the ownership subject, since we're kind of talking about that, that's what caught my eye here first. This process of leveraging how much ownership is appropriate and how much projected points are worth sacrificing, this process gets more and more dialed in and more valuable to you the more accurate your ownership projections are. So we're planning on putting in some work to continue to improve the ownership projections. I know in NBA in particular, there's always just a sport where ownership is very important. So I know there's always a lot of feedback whenever there's a night where our ownership projections are not perfect, or we miss on a couple players. So we're planning on continuing to improve those. But if you have a sense of where ownership is going to go, or you think that there is value to be added by looking at ownership, do it, right? This can only get better the more and more accurate the ownerships are. With that said, adjusting projections are great too. I wouldn't say there's one place that you can add more value than the other in terms of it making an adjustment to a player's projection or ownership. For me personally, I find it very easy to kind of see where I think ownership is off, less so with projections, right? I can look at a slate a little bit and kind of have at least a little bit of a sense of where I think ownership projections are going, or where ownership is going to go, or maybe where some adjustments are worth making. And I'm wrong sometimes. I don't have as much of a sense of looking at an individual player projection and kind of determining where I think that's off. Does that make sense? Right? Like, well, I haven't really studied this slate too much, but often what I do a lot of times is typically what I'll do is I'll look at the highest overall projected players. I'll look at the studs. I'll look at the highest overall value players, and I'll look at the highest overall projected ownership players and make a couple changes here or there based on what I think is going to happen with a player's ownership. I have less of a sense of making kind of an intuitive call of where projections are off. But I don't think one of those is inherently more valuable than the other to the process. It's all going to help give you an additional edge and differentiate you. So, okay, cool. Let's keep it going. Shelby asked, and I apologize that this we're getting to these questions here later in the stream, but Shelby said, I'm wondering if the lineups that are generated are the best ones to play based on projections. So let me talk about this here a little bit. So one of kind of the big thesis behind what we are basically trying to do with SaberSim here is basically saying that you don't win GPPs, you don't win DFS contests by building lineups that have the highest average outcome or that succeed the most when all the average outcomes are hit, right? We want lineups that are built for ceilings, right? You can even just see it here. 285 fantasy points is not going to win anybody a GPP tonight, right? We all can kind of just know that, right? You need the lineup that scores 350 or whatever, right? We need the ceiling outcome. So kind of the whole way that we've built SaberSim here is to account for and try to build lineups that are optimized for ceiling outcomes. So that means when we build lineups, we care about correlation and ownership and things like that. But we also take random sized buckets of simulations of each player's game to build the optimal lineups around that, right? We don't really care what happens on the average. We want to see, what's the best possible lineup we can build when this set of game outcomes takes place. That's how the lineups are built. So in that, and I promise I'm getting here to answer your question, Shelby, because I know I've kind of started off maybe in a different direction than you might have expected. By the same coin that we don't want to build lineups based on what are the best lineups on average, we also don't want to decide what the best lineups are to play based on how they do on average. So your lineups, when you build on SaberSim, will be sorted instead by something called SaberScore by default. We have an option in here to sort by projected score, which is what you would see on a traditional optimizer, right? Just highest projected lineups. But we've created this SaberScore calculation as a way to quantify how high the upside of a lineup is. So it takes into account how correlated the lineup is, how much ownership it fades, and the raw upside of those individual players in the sims that were selected for that particular lineup. And it's our attempt, it's always standardized to 100. So in any build, your highest SaberScore lineup is always 100. And it's our attempt essentially, I keep tripping on my tongue here today, to quantify upside. So in general, we would say that the best lineups in your pool are the top SaberScore lineups, but the entire pool is what we would say viable for the contest that you tell us you're playing. So this set of lineups was built for a 150 max with 50K plus lineups. And our kind of stance on this would be that the entire pool of 500 lineups was probably viable for the contest, but these 150 are sorted by the highest upside lineups that we think have the highest upside. So a little bit of a different approach than what you might have seen with a traditional optimizer or a different optimizer. So, and then I saw you also mentioned having trouble downloading entries from DraftKings to SaberSim. I think probably what would be the most useful is if you sent a screenshot of the issue you were seeing and send it to the support channel in our Slack or email us, support@sabersim.com. Happy to help. Me or somebody else from the support team will be able to figure out what's going on, but going to be a little bit difficult for me to perfectly troubleshoot maybe what issue you're running into here on stream. So, but I mean, I would say I'm not entered into DraftKings. The easiest way to get your entries from DraftKings into SaberSim is to just click this download template file from DK. It will immediately download a file and you can just drag and drop it here. That is probably the easiest way to do it. It goes directly to the right place on DK and downloads the right file, and then you avoid any issues there. So TCAP has a couple questions here. How do I create the following rules for only wanting to play 2 out of 3 players and also create a rule for no more than 4 players? Okay, I'm going to give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer here is that there's not an easy way in the app at the moment to set a kind of rule or player group that does this thing. So there's not really, at the moment, there's no way to say, here's a group of 3 players, every lineup must have 2. Or here's a group of 4 and play and say, what is this one? Or okay, here's a group of 8 and use no more than 4. We do have some basic like stacking rules for NBA, or really for any sport, but you could go in here and say, if this was on a team level, for example, you could say no more than 4 players from the same team and select the individual teams you're using, right? And this is something that you can kind of do pretty easily, but this isn't on an individual player level. So I know Max has talked about doing this a little bit before here as a way to just avoid lineups that are overweight to one particular team. I think you could even justify doing no more than 3 players on the same team. We are planning on adding something to kind of do this roughly, but there is no way to do it at the moment. So I'll continue. Here's kind of still the short answer. The easiest way to do this at the moment, and it is easier the less lineups you are wanting to play, right, is to do this by using our filters on step 3. So let's just say, for example, that we wanted to look at this and we didn't want to play any lineups that had Anthony Simons, Bradley Beal, and Naz Reid if they're going to be the 3 highest players, right? We only want 2 of those 3. Well, what we can do is filter by lineups that include all 3. We have 29 in our pool, right? And we can uncheck these from the pool, right? Now, again, I mentioned this is going to be more and more tedious the more lineups in your pool you're playing. If you were playing 5 lineups, it might not be such a big deal to just do this. But if you're playing 150, this is going to be tedious. So we do want to add a way to control this. So it is coming. Now I'm going to give you the long answer. And it's not so long. Don't mean to scare anybody off. Don't want anybody running. But it's not too long. But the long answer here, or maybe the more complicated answer, is that the reason we would want to do these things to our lineups in general is either to create correlation in the lineup or avoid negative correlation, or to create lineups that are properly leveraged from the standpoint of ownership for the contest we're playing, right? I think these are the 2 most common things. You may say, I don't want these 2 players to be in the same lineup together because they are negatively correlated, right? Or I don't want all 3 of these players in the lineup because there's too much cumulative ownership. Or I want to make sure there's one of these guys in every single lineup because they are kind of my low-owned core, and I want to make sure I have one of these guys everywhere, right? And that's fine. I think that's great. I think it could be a good way to get some of these impacts into your lineups, but it's always important to remember that SaberSim is thinking about these things already when lineups are constructed, right? So on the standpoint of correlation, because we're simulating all the games play by play here, right? We can understand exactly what players are correlated to one another and by how much. So I think correlation often gets thought of as this binary thing where a player is either positively correlated to another player, and that's a good thing, and we should force that into the lineups at the expense of everything else, or they're negatively correlated, and that's a bad thing, and they can never be played together in the lineups. Well, what actually happens with SaberSim is that we will weight the correlation values that we have for individual players accordingly and compare it to the ownership of those players as well as the upside that they have in the lineup, in the sims that were used to build that lineup, and decide if those players do make sense to be used together. So, for example, hold on, let me say this. You may see a Jokic plus Aaron Gordon lineup together. These are players that do have a slight negative correlation, but at their ownership and at the upside that they may have in a certain game script, right? Maybe in that sim, the game goes to overtime or it goes 20 points over the implied total. They can both succeed together. They will show up less together in lineups in accordance with how negatively correlated they are, but you don't need to set a rule to force it that they never show up in the lineups together, right? Same deal with the example before. If we were talking about from the standpoint of ownership, are there lineups where the 3 highest projected owned players all show up together, even in a 150 max, 50K plus contest, right? Let me do this again. Do these three extremely chalky players all show up together in the lineup, same lineup together sometimes? Yes, but look at the rest of this lineup, right? There are low-owned pieces getting into this lineup here, and it's not as if these players are just getting jammed together in the lineup because they're all projected very well, and you're getting otherwise a very cashy lineup that's far too owned for the contest you're playing. That's not the case. We're considering ownership and comparing it to other factors like correlation and upside as it makes sense and as is appropriate for the contest that you say you're playing. So all of this to say, we want our users to feel like they have the maximum amount of control over the lineups that they're playing. So if you say, great, Jordan, I get it. I hear everything you're saying, but I don't want to play Naz Reid, Bradley Beal, and Anthony Simons all together. I just don't. I'm not going to do it. We want to give you that level of control. And we know at the moment that it's a little tedious to do this yourself. But that said, we also want to automate as much of the kind of busy work of DFS that a computer should be able to just do more efficiently anyway. And that is the way that our ownership fade and correlation and sim variant sliders are set up, is to automate thinking about that kind of thing. So anyway, short answer, long answer. Short answer, you can't do it right now, but it's coming. Long answer, maybe you don't even need to do it at all. And we're at least considering these things that on a traditional optimizer, you're left to think about completely for yourself. So, but really good question. Okay. Let's see. I see a couple comments here. Cody, earlier when we were talking about Edmund, said with situations like this, people run away from the uncertainty. You can get easy leverage on a player in a smash spot that would normally be 30% owned if we knew earlier. Exactly. Well said. He said, I personally built it so 50% of my lineups had Edmonds and could pivot to Penny or Mitchell if Connor was active. Yeah, I think that's fine too. I think on certain NBA slates that even makes sense to kind of count on the fact, especially if there's a big name player who's questionable playing in a late game on a slate where there otherwise isn't a lot of value, to me is like the home run to intentionally creating some opportunities to late swap. And I think that can make sense. But yeah, well said. Okay, let's see. I hit some of these questions here. TCAP, I obviously just covered that question. I know, see, you asked it again here. Let me know if that helps. Tracy said, is upside based off the ceiling score? If so, if I increase a projection, am I reducing the upside, causing me to get less lineups with that player? Definitely not. Or, I mean, if you increase the projection of a player, you are likely to get more of that player most of the time. Obviously, there's a kind of spectrum of results there, and depending on how much you bump the player, it can make some differences. I mean, I think maybe kind of the important thing to remember here is if you increase Jokic's projection, for example, it's not just that you're changing the mean to be a different value, right? You're shifting the entire range of outcomes. So if you move his projection to 60.24, right, and you are building and you get that sim where he scores 80 points, right? Now he scored 85, right? So, I mean, I guess that in that example, you would have gotten him either way. But now let's use the example maybe in this case where he scored, you pull a sim where he scored 50 points, right? Well, now he scored 55 because you bumped his projection, and where maybe he wasn't optimal in the lineup at 50, but he is at 55, so he's going to get used more. So you're not just changing the mean, right? You're shifting an entire distribution one direction or the other. So you almost certainly get a little bit more of a player when you increase their projection and a little bit less when you decrease it. So let me know if that helps. But Andrew said, a little behind in the stream, wanted to note because I had trouble with this. If you use DuckDuckGo, you can't download the entry file on mobile. Have to switch to Safari when late swapping. Okay, I've never used DuckDuckGo's browser. I would say if in general, very good thing to check if you are running into issues in general is to use Chrome or Firefox. I think those are probably the two best browsers that I've seen success. I think Edge works too, but I know we do have issues at times with Safari, especially older versions of Safari. And I've never used DuckDuckGo's mobile browser, so I don't know. Wouldn't be surprised if there was an issue there as well. But yeah. definitely something to check on that. So, and then Shelby chimed in here. I'm using an Android phone to download the lineups from DK to SaberSim. I don't have a computer. I watched the video on YouTube, and you guys are using a computer. That could be the difference. Thanks. Yeah. So on this one, let me show you something here. So I have an Android too. If you go to our support.sabersim.com, right? And just in the search bar, type mobile. And then how can I use the entry editor on a mobile device? This video I recorded on my Android phone of me kind of walking through the steps for both DraftKings and FanDuel. It's like 10 minutes long. So I checked this out. You should be able to, this should help. With a phone, it's a little bit different just because sometimes I think probably the easiest thing that can trip you up is if you have a phone setting or a browser setting set on the phone that is set to open files instead of download them, right? I know some people have an issue where they click the download template file from DraftKings and it just opens up their entries file in the browser, and that's not super helpful. If that happens, there's normally like a browser setting that you can change that says download instead of save, or there might just be an option on that page that says download. That's, I think, the biggest thing that can trip you up, but this video should help walk you through how to do this for both DraftKings and FanDuel on a phone. So, Josh said definitely need a laptop or a computer. Uploading from your phone is the worst. I think it's easier. I think it's a lot easier on DraftKings. If I only had a phone to do this, I would probably just play mostly just on DraftKings just because it's a little bit easier. But it's much better than it used to be. We've put a lot of work into mobile optimizing this. So, but TCAP said, yes, it helps. Thanks. I'm all for letting the optimizer do its work. I do think that there are times based on recent rotations and closing lineups that slight manual adjustments are helpful as well. I completely agree. And the last thing I ever want to, the last like vibe I ever want to give off on these shows is that you should just only listen to SaberSim and do exactly what SaberSim says and never touch anything or anything like that. And there are definitely a lot of ways to add value, both in making adjustments to projections and ownerships, but also in setting rules to have the lineup builder build better lineups, and in your selection process or your quality control process in step 3. So I never want to give the indication that ways that you guys are trying to add value don't or aren't good or anything like that, because that's not the point I'm trying to make. But when there are questions about like, how can I set this player group? How can I make a group of 3 and say only use max 2, right? I always just want to make sure that people kind of understand that what is happening here is very, very different than what happens on other optimizers, because there's really nothing out there that's doing this. Like if you go and use the Fantasy Labs or Fantasy Cruncher or RotoGrinders optimizers or anything like that, you're going to see a very familiar player group setting that does basically the same thing. This is very different. The last note I'll make on this too, because I don't think I really mentioned it clearly in the first time I answered this question, and it's kind of made me think about it, is, not only are we looking at the correlation of players on average and weighting it accordingly for that particular lineup, right? So we might look, and see that Giannis has a slight on average negative correlation with his other stars, Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton. Right. But it's also important to remember that, those average correlations are low and they're on the average, but in the individual simulations themselves, because these are play-by-play game simulations, we kind of naturally, you get some additional natural correlation in the lineup, right? Because these lineups are built from buckets or subsets of actual game scripts, like a play-by-play game script of a basketball game. Right. So if you're getting a lineup where you're getting Drew Holiday, maybe you're getting a lineup where you're getting Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton and Giannis all 3 together. Right. And probably not very many of those, but maybe you get a lineup and you're asking yourself, like, how is that possible? Right. In a lot of ways, what that's actually saying is that not only did those 3 players, have the raw upside in that set of sims to outweigh the fact that they are all slightly negatively correlated together, it's actually also saying that there is an actual basketball game script of the way that game can play out that leads to all 3 of those players having that outcome, right? It's not even not only are we considering the average correlations of a player across the full range of outcomes, you're actually looking at individual scripts of a game. It's not even just pure luck that those 3 players are kind of getting in there, right? Let me put this another way. you could be using a traditional tool and apply just like a generic randomness on a player and then roll a lineup that included all three of those players together because they all happen to roll the, traditional randomness on another optimizer might, if you set it to 20%, they're basically going to put, they're going to change the player's floor to 80% of the average projection and the ceiling to 120% of the average projection and randomly select for a lineup or randomly select for a projection somewhere in there, right? That's how traditional randomness works. And you could potentially roll a lineup that had all three of those players in it together, and it would be pure luck. All three of those players just happen to roll the ceiling outcome in that window. That's not what's happening here, right? Because there are actually sims backing this up, right? Play-by-play game scripts that we have tens of thousands of, right? You actually know that if you're getting lineups that have those combinations of players together, there are game scripts that fit that particular outcome. So anyway, I think we'll go ahead and leave that there. RJ asked a quick question here. What's the best way to build the highest projected scoring lineup for cash? Easiest thing to do, go into your build settings, change style to cash, boom, build as many lineups as you want. I think in general, probably don't need more than 10 or 20. A lot of times, I don't play a lot of cash, but when I have in the past, I'll build 20 or so just so I have like a pool of lineups that I can look at a little bit and see how the optimals look. But turn correlation off, ownership fade off, sim variance off, build the highest projected average scoring lineups we can, and build. Since you asked about cash, and I have an opportunity to plug it while this is building here, I think that 5%, probably 5% of your time when you're playing cash games is really worth thinking about the lineup construction itself. 5%. The other 95% of your time is probably should be spent on contest selection and finding the weakest opponents possible. I think that is the edge in cash games at this point in 2022, and probably maybe the only edge in cash games at this point. Now that projections and optimizers are as present as they are. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about that for either NFL or NBA, I'd watch our videos on it on our YouTube channel, NFL course, NBA course. The cash games one for NBA is right here, how to beat NBA cash games. For NFL, finding an edge in NFL DFS cash games. And what you'll see, both of these videos have a very, very heavy focus on contest selection, because I think that is the primary edge. I mean, I think literally the cash game process on SaberSim is more or less running this build exactly as I just described it. And, I think maybe you can spend a little bit of time picking out a lineup that maybe has a little bit more ownership or gives you a little bit more flexibility for late swapping or something like that. But most of the time, it's really just running the build with whatever projections, SaberSim projections, or your updates or whatever you want to do, picking the top overall lineup, and then intentionally going out and finding softer opponents to play it against. That's cash. So, but yeah. Anyway, since you gave me a window to plug a video and talk about contest selection, two of my favorite things here for those of you that are pretty familiar with this stream. But Shelby did say, where can I watch the video at for the phone? Thanks. I don't know. Maybe Shelby, maybe you're just listening here, or it's right here. So on support, I'll read it out loud, I guess. Support.sabersim.com will take you to our help desk or take you to our help documentation. In the search bar, just type mobile, hit enter, search. The first article that comes up says, how can I use the entry editor on a mobile device? And if you click that, it will take you into the FAQ, and there's a video there embedded directly in the article that you can watch, and it'll show you step-by-step how to do it on your phone. So, all right. I think we managed to get to everything here today. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. That was a fun stream here again today. Had a lot of questions, talked about all kinds of different stuff. But I think probably most interestingly, a lot of conversation about thinking about ownership and correlation and projection as it relates to the contest you're playing, also the individual sport, and how these things kind of all play in together, building a high upside lineup, how SaberSim takes into account these different things. Congratulations again to our winners and our giveaway winners of the weekly max challenge for week 17. We'll make sure we get all the prizes out later this afternoon. We will be back here, of course, again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions as you are building your lineups for tonight, for the NBA slate, for Monday Night Football, I think there's a single game hockey slate too. Maybe you're playing that. As always, feel free to pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or email us support@sabersim.com overnight, and we'll get to those questions tomorrow. But we will be right back here again then. So until then, thanks, good luck, and I'll see you tomorrow. See ya.